This morning we're going to look at Philippians chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. For many Christians, Philippians is their favorite of Paul's epistles, and for many of those people, chapter 3 is their favorite chapter from this epistle. I love to read the book of Philippians every new year, every January. I love to spend some time meditating in this book. It speaks to me so much about the proper Christian attitude, about life. And I thought we'd look this morning at what Paul has to say. We're going to read in Philippians chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. Paul writes, "Finally, my brothers, rejoice in the Lord. It is no trouble for me to write the same things to you again, and it is a safeguard for you. Watch out for those dogs, those men who do evil, those mutilators of the flesh. For it is we who are the circumcision, we who worship by the Spirit of God, who glory in Christ Jesus, and who put no confidence in the flesh. Though I myself have reasons for such confidence. If anyone else thinks he has reasons to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. In regard to the law, a Pharisee. As for zeal, persecuting the church. As for legalistic righteousness, faultless. But whatever was to me profit, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. What is more, I consider everything a loss compared to the surpassing greatness of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them rubbish, that I may gain Christ." A few years back, Charlie Sheen, if you know who that is, he's an actor who's had quite a few drug problems over the years. He videoed himself in kind of a rambling his thoughts on life in general and how things were going for him. It was intended to be very upbeat, and every so often during his video montage he would say something about his life, how well it was going, and he would say, "Winning," and that has kind of crept its way into the modern vernacular. People will still say that sometimes, winning, and it's meant to describe how well things are going in your life. In Charlie Sheen's case, it was basically that he had enough money to fund his life of debauchery. Paul talks about winning in this chapter, but in an entirely different way. For Paul, winning was getting rid of everything in his life that stood in the way of the one single thing that was of most importance to him, and that was knowing Christ Jesus in the fullness of the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his suffering. Let's look at a few of the verses here. Just a few things I want to point out to you this morning. The meat of what we're going to look at is in verses 7 and 8, but I want to look at verse 1. It all begins with attitude, doesn't it? Paul says, "Finally, my brothers, rejoice in the Lord." Now, you might think, well, that's easy for Paul to say. Everything was going well in Paul's life at this point. Not at all. Paul was in prison when he wrote this epistle, not knowing even if he had a future on this earth. But he reminds us that the single most important thing about life for the Christian is our attitude, isn't it? I can make a prediction right now about all of us. At some point during this year, and this will be true for every one of us, you will have some hardships. You'll have difficulties. You'll have trials. They may be financial. They may be health. They may be family related. They may have something to do with your work. You will not go through this year unscathed. Trouble will come to visit in your home. And the single most important thing about the trouble that you face is not the nature of the trouble, but rather your attitude about the trouble. Your attitude as a Christian will be more important than your actual circumstances. And that was true of Paul. This brief letter that he writes from a prison cell, this word joy, when he says rejoice in the Lord, and that's the proper Christian attitude, even in the midst of suffering, even in the midst of trials. 16 times in the 4 chapters he reminds Christians to rejoice in the Lord. And so every trial that you face this year, I want you to keep this thought in mind. Every trial that you face is an opportunity for you to grow closer to the Lord, because the Lord will be there with you in every trial that you face. I was reading recently about a man named Martin Rinkert. Now, you probably don't know the name, but you'll know something about him. You already know something about him probably, and I'll tell you in a moment what it is. Rinkert was a German pastor in the 1600s. He was born to a very poor family, but he was a hard-working guy. He managed to work his way enough to go through school, through college, and then he went to a seminary. And he was overjoyed when he graduated from seminary and he was appointed as the minister in his hometown. Now, he had 1 year of a relatively uneventful ministry. At the beginning of his 2nd year of ministry, what came to be known in Europe as the 30 Years' War broke out. And his hometown was battlefield central for that war that lasted 30 years. 17 years into his ministry, still in that same parish, one of the great plagues, the bubonic plague that swept through Europe 2 or 3 times during those centuries, began again. And his town was one of the towns that was wiped out. An average of 50 people a day died in his little town of Eilenberg. And he was called on to bury most of them. In all, in that town, 8,000 people died in that plague, including his own wife. Now, his career lasted 32 years. 30 of them were plagued by the 30 Years' War. The plague that came through devastated his congregation, devastated his family. He had 2 years of peace, 2 years of tranquility in a 32-year ministry. Now that was almost 400 years ago. During that period of calamity in his own life, that pastor wrote a hymn. We don't sing it a lot in Baptist churches. We should. I don't even know if it's in our hymnal, but you probably know it. It includes these famous words: "Now thank we all our God with hearts and hands and voices, who wondrous things hath done, in whom the world rejoices." That's the spirit Paul is talking about. He could have been devastated by all the loss, devastated by all the calamity, but in the midst of all of his troubles, which affected him personally, his own wife died, he was able to look to God in praise. Martin Rinkert's troubles have long since passed. Almost 400 years now. His troubles are long over. But Christian churches around the world are still singing that great hymn that he wrote. And so that's what Paul says. When trouble comes, look up. God is there with you. And so give praise to God. Rejoice in the Lord. Now look in verse 3. He says he puts no confidence in the flesh. The flesh there would refer to earthly things, physical advantages, human accomplishments. He's talking here kind of in religious terms. If I were to ask you, if somebody said, what are your spiritual bona fides? Tell me what you've done for the Lord. Tell me how you've served the Lord. My own case, I might say things like, well, from the time I was saved, I was in church every time the doors were open. Wednesday night prayer meeting, Sunday school, morning service, church training in the afternoon, back when they called it training union, and then evening services, visitation during the week, choir practice during the week. Whatever the church did, I was there doing it. That's what Paul does here in this list of things he gives us. He's telling us his spiritual bona fides. And the reason he did it, remember, Paul was a great preacher of grace. So much so that evidently there were some folks in that church, and maybe the churches in that area, who were thinking of Paul, well, you know, you preach grace, Brother Paul, because you don't have a good life to boast of. You don't have any spiritual accomplishments that you can be proud of. That's why you preach grace all the time. A friend of mine, a guy I worked with at the California Baptist Convention, he left not just the convention, but he left the ministry very abruptly. And it was kind of startling to all of us. He went into business. He and another fellow opened a transmission shop. And a few years later, he got arrested for murder. He and two other fellas robbed the home of a man who was the director of one of these marijuana dispensers, you know, the dispensaries that you find throughout California. I guess they thought the man stored the stuff in his home. And so they broke into his house, tied him up, and during the commission of that felony, robbing him, they murdered him. And when he went on trial, it came out that he had hired a hitman to kill his business partner in the transmission business. Now, this man did years in the federal penitentiary, rightly so. And I heard a few months back that he's out of the penitentiary now and he's preaching again. So I thought, I want to hear what he's saying. So I was told that one of his messages was on YouTube, and I found it. And you want to know what he's preaching? He's preaching about the grace of God. Right? Because he's known it. He's experienced it. And there might have been some people in this church who were saying to Paul, the only reason you talk about grace, you don't have anything to brag about. And Paul lets them know with this list of his spiritual bona fides, that's not true. Look what he says in verse 5. Some of these things won't make a whole lot of sense to you because they're foreign to us, but when he says, for example, circumcised on the 8th day, well, circumcision was performed in memory of the covenant that God established with Abraham. And so when Paul is saying that he did that, he's saying, I came from a good religious family that kept all the law of Moses, did all the things they were supposed to do. He said, I was of the people of Israel. That's verse 5 also. He's saying, in other words, my parents weren't Gentile converts. We're God's people. Of the tribe of Benjamin, he says. Now, there were 12 tribes, all named after the 12 sons of Jacob. There was only one son who was born in the promised land, and that was Benjamin. And so because of that, the tribe of Benjamin was considered special. It was also one of the only two tribes that didn't fall into idolatry, along with Judah when the other tribes did. So the tribe of Benjamin was a special tribe. And so Paul says, I'm of the tribe of Benjamin. That's his family and heritage, but he also gives his personal achievements. Verse 5, he says, a Hebrew of Hebrews. Now in Paul's day, there were two different kinds of Hebrews or Jews. Much like we would have here in California. We've got a big immigration issue going on now. There were, in Paul's area, a lot of people who had come from other parts of the Roman Empire, and they were technically Hebrews, but people would have said not really. They didn't speak the Hebrew language. They didn't really observe the Hebrew culture. They observed some kind of Greek culture. They spoke the Greek language. They weren't real Hebrews. Paul is saying, we're Hebrew of Hebrews, my family. Verse 6, he says, I was a Pharisee. He belonged to the strictest religious tradition among the Jews. Verse 6 also, concerning zeal, a persecutor of the church. You've heard of Sunday-only Christians? Well, Paul was no Sabbath-only Jew. He lived it to the point, and Mary, you were saying this in Sunday school today, he persecuted the church because he thought it was the right thing to do before he was saved. And he did it with zeal. Also in verse 6, he says, as to the law, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. Now, he's not saying he was perfect. He was saying he kept every part of the law, that he was so devout that no one could find fault in him. That's his list of bona fides. But look at what he says in verse 7. I count it all as loss. Everything he had inherited, everything he had accomplished, he was willing to lose in order to gain Christ. That word count in verse 7 is a technical term, like accounting, like we would say today. I can picture Paul here with a ledger before him as he has his list of pluses and minuses, credits and debits, assets and liabilities. And everything that's in the asset column, Paul now places them in the debit column. And he says, what things were gained to me, I have counted these as loss for Christ. In fact, he says in verse 8, I consider them to be rubbish, garbage. And that's something, all of those things that Paul just listed, all of his family background, all of the things he had inherited, all that he had accomplished, he said it's all rubbish. You know, we spend our lifetime, sometimes even as Christians, pursuing things and accruing things, collecting things that in the end will be of no value. I read that little children's poem, Hector the Collector, about this little boy who spends his childhood collecting things and he keeps them in a treasure box, and at the end of the poem he calls his little friends to come over, and it says this, speaking of all of his possessions, it says he loved them more than shining diamonds, he loved them more than glistening gold. Then he said to his friends, come and share my treasure trunk, and they all came and looked and called it junk. What are the things that you are spending your lifetime collecting? And when you stand before God on Judgment Day, will they have been junk or things that have eternal consequences? Paul said, I'm willing to give it all up, in verse 8, that I may gain Christ. The moment Paul was saved, he lost his family, he lost his friends, he lost his heritage, he lost his accomplishments, he lost everything. But the reason he was willing to lose all of that is that what he gained in return was worth more than what he gave up. Paul was willing to give up what he couldn't keep, to gain what he could never lose. And Paul's desire was, and he goes into more detail in this later in the chapter, but his desire was to know Christ in the power of his resurrection and in the fellowship of his sufferings. And that was worth more to him than anything else in his life. Now, we're at the beginning of a new year here, and I want to ask you a question. What are you living for, and how long will it last? Those things you're giving your life to, are you having to move Jesus out of the way in order to have them? Anything that interferes with your relationship with Jesus, anything that gets in the way, is by definition wrong for a Christian, even if it's not sinful in and of itself. Those things that push you away from Jesus or that crowd Jesus out of your life are wrong by definition. So I ask you this morning as we begin this new year together, what are you willing to give up that you might gain Christ, that you might grow closer to Christ and to know him fully and intimately? I read a story recently about a young woman named Debbie who flew on a jet airplane. The airplane, or the airline, mangled Debbie's luggage. Her purse disappeared. Instead of entering the airport through a covered corridor, she stumbled off the plane in the pouring rain. And there she was at the end of the flight, drenched, far from home, with no money, no identification, no dry clothes. And under normal circumstances, Debbie would have been furious. But on this night, it didn't matter. Because Debbie had just survived the flight of 1420 in Little Rock, Arkansas. The date was June 1st, 1999. The plane had crashed. And I read this testimony from her. She said, when I walked off that plane, I walked off with nothing. And then I stopped and thought, I have everything. Because she realized that her life was more important than the things she had lost. That's something of what Paul is saying here. Sometimes it takes a dramatic event to alter our perspective on life. Paul had come to the conclusion that nothing in his life was worth more than knowing Jesus. And that anything that stood in the way of his knowing Jesus fully, not just in some peripheral way, not just Jesus as some minor part of your life, but to know him fully, as Paul said, in the power of his resurrection and in the fellowship of his sufferings, that was worth more to Paul than everything else. And so he said, everything that gets in the way of that, I count it as garbage, that I might know Christ. Do you want to grow closer to the Lord this year? If you do, what are you willing to do to accomplish that? And what are you willing to get rid of to accomplish that? If it's standing in the way, get rid of it. We're going to sing this morning hymn number 275, I Surrender All. Let's meet.